In the wild, silence can mean safety or signal something far worse. When bears strike, it's sudden, brutal, and often final. From a grizzly rampage in Sakhalin to a teen clawed from her hammock in the Appalachians, these true encounters reveal how fast peace turns to panic. With cabins breached, tents torn, and rivers stained red, this video explores 6 terrifying bear attacks where survival hung by a thread. On the morning of June 10, 2025, 4 longtime friends, Ivan Petrov, Sergei Lebedev, Alexei Sidorov, and Timur Danilov, set out for an ATV ride deep in the pine-covered highlands of central Sakhalin Island. All 4 were in their early 30s, born and raised in the rugged Russian Far East, and no strangers to the forest. Ivan, a quiet mechanic from Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, had planned the ride to celebrate Sergei's recent engagement. They packed light, wore helmets, and followed a logging trail that wound through thick brush and over uneven rain-softened terrain. By midday, the sky had turned a pale gray, and the wind had begun to pick up. The forest, normally rich with birdsong and the creak of branches, had grown strangely quiet. Ivan noticed it first, how the birds had vanished and how the pine trees stood motionless despite the rising wind. They had been riding single file through a narrow gully when Alexei, leading the group, paused and pointed at fresh claw marks gouged into a tree trunk. The gashes were wide and deep, the bark still flaking off. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but pressed on. A few hundred meters farther, the gully opened into a clearing littered with the remains of a broken animal trap. Blood soaked the ground around it, and clumps of fur were scattered nearby. As Timur slowed his ATV, a low growl rose from the trees behind them. The forest erupted in movement. A massive grizzly bear burst from the underbrush with terrifying speed, its fur dark with patches of dried blood, its gait uneven but ferocious. Ivan saw the animal's left hind leg dragging slightly, and its ribs pressing hard against its skin, injured, starving, and unmistakably enraged. The bear was almost on top of them before they could react. In a frantic attempt to turn, Ivan's ATV struck a stump and flipped violently onto its side, pinning him beneath the weight of the machine. His helmet cracked against the rocks as the handlebars pressed into his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs. Through the narrow gap between the plastic fairing and the forest floor, he could see the others scrambling to escape. Sergei accelerated, but clipped Alexei's rear tire, sending both ATVs sideways. Alexei was thrown into the dirt and tried to rise, but the bear was already there. It struck him once across the shoulder, sending him tumbling, then lunged forward and bit down hard into his upper back. His scream was cut short as the bear's weight crushed him against the earth. Sergei tried to reverse away, but his wheels spun uselessly in the soft dirt. The bear rose and moved on him in seconds. From his trapped position, Ivan watched in horror as the grizzly slammed into Sergei's machine, knocking it sideways. Sergei was pulled from the seat and thrown like a rag doll. The bear's jaws clamped around his leg and dragged him across the ground. Timur had jumped from his ATV and tried to run uphill toward the trees, but the bear caught his movement and released Sergei, now unmoving, to chase him. Timur reached the tree line, but his foot caught on a root and he fell hard. The bear closed the distance and crashed down on him, striking with both paws. Timur's limbs flailed briefly, then stilled. The clearing fell into a tense, blood-soaked silence, broken only by the grizzly's wheezing breaths as it paced the area. It moved slowly now, clearly injured, sniffing the torn bodies of its victims as if deciding whether to feed or leave. Ivan, crushed beneath his ATV, could only lie still, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might echo through the forest. The bear came closer. Its heavy steps thudded against the soil, and Ivan could smell its musk and the coppery tang of blood. It walked right up to his overturned vehicle and sniffed at the plastic and metal. It pressed its shoulder against the frame, trying to get closer, but the machine's weight held steady. Ivan didn't move, didn't even blink. The bear growled and pawed once at the side of the ATV, then turned away with a frustrated snort. For several long minutes, the bear lingered. Ivan could hear it panting, occasionally letting out short, guttural moans. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it limped off into the forest, vanishing between the pines. Ivan didn't move for another 10 minutes. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made him flinch. When he finally shifted, he did so slowly, wriggling from beneath the ATV's weight. His left hip screamed in pain, and his ribs felt bruised, but he was alive. He limped toward Timur's ATV, the only one still upright and not bloodied. Starting the engine felt impossibly loud, and for a moment, he feared the bear would come back. But the forest remained silent. He rode the machine back down the trail, gripping the handlebars with shaking hands, his vision blurry from tears and shock. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the nearest ranger station, where he collapsed inside the entrance, barely able to speak. A search team returned with him before nightfall, but they found only what Ivan had described. 3 bodies torn and lifeless, the ATVs wrecked, and the signs of a massive grizzly with a damaged hind leg. Wildlife officials later confirmed that several poacher traps had been discovered nearby, their iron jaws rusted and illegal. Tracks suggested the bear had been caught 1 week earlier, dragging the device until it broke. Starvation and infection had made the animal reckless. The attacks, they said, were desperate acts of survival. Ivan's survival was called a miracle by some, a curse by others. He never returned to the forest. His friends were buried side by side in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, and their families demanded stricter patrolling and removal of traps from the forest. The events of that June afternoon changed the region. Tour guides canceled summer trips. Authorities placed new restrictions on off-trail ATV use. But for Ivan, none of it mattered. The memory of those 5 minutes in the clearing, the blood, the screams, the weight of the bear pressing against his hiding place, would stay with him for the rest of his life. On the tundra just south of Resolute Bay, in the early morning hours of March 27, 2023, silence hung over the landscape like a blanket of snow. It was the kind of cold that crept into bone, the kind that stiffened every movement and made even breath feel like a burden. The wind had been quiet that night, and the stars had shone clearly above the family's small cabin, standing alone near the edge of a thinning spruce grove. Inside, 8-year-old Kimia lay curled beneath 2 thick layers of caribou hide blankets, her face pressed to her pillow, her breathing steady and deep. Across the small room, her younger brother Noah, not yet 2, slept in a hand-built crib beside a worn cedar shelf. Their mother, Aluki, a 35-year-old nurse and seasoned hunter, slept lightly in the next room, one ear always tuned to the wind and the other to the dogs. The family had lived at the outpost since late 2020, choosing the isolation for its quiet and for Aluki's research work with the regional health agency. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a snowmobile accident, and the cabin, passed down through generations, had become her sanctuary. It was heavily insulated, designed to keep out the biting cold and wildlife alike. Just after 3 a.m., the dogs began barking. It wasn't their usual alarm, but something sharper, more frantic, rising in pitch with each passing second. At first, Aluki thought it might be a fox, or even a wandering caribou, but as she reached for her boots, she felt it. That low, almost imperceptible tremor through the floorboards. Something massive was outside. By the time she reached the window, the largest sled dog had broken its chain, trying to lunge toward the back of the cabin. Aluki's heart pounded as she spotted a shadow, huge and lumbering, circling near the rear entrance. The bear moved silently, despite its size. Pale fur, yellowed by age and grime, shimmered in the moonlight. Its head was low, black eyes fixed on the source of the scent inside. Then came a deep, guttural growl, followed by a deafening crash. The back window, fortified with double panes and a wooden shutter, shattered inward. Shards of glass exploded into the room where Kimia and Noah slept. A massive paw reached through the opening, claws dragging across the floorboards. Kimia awoke to the sound, eyes wide, frozen with fear as a second paw shoved aside the wooden shutter and widened the hole. The polar bear shoved its head through the gap, nostrils flaring, teeth bared. It clawed at the shelf above Noah's crib, tearing it free and sending heavy cans, books, and tools crashing down inches from the baby's face. The bear tried to climb inside, its massive frame straining against the wall's limits. Kimia couldn't scream. She couldn't even move. Aluki burst through the door a second later, bare feet slapping the frozen floor, flare pistol gripped in trembling hands. She saw the bear halfway inside the room, front paws planted among shattered furniture, its fur soaked in blood from the broken glass, its breath steaming in the cold air. Without thinking, she raised the pistol and fired. The flare struck the bear's left shoulder with a flash of light and a crackle of fire. The creature roared, the sound shaking the cabin's walls, and yanked itself backward, smashing part of the window frame as it retreated. Kimia heard its claws scrabbling on the wood as it backed away, then silence, broken only by the hiss of the still-burning flare lodged in the wall. Noah was crying now, his tiny face streaked with tears, his blankets covered in broken splinters from the fallen shelf. Aluki rushed forward, lifted him from the crib, and carried him close to her chest. Kimia stumbled from her bed, feet crunching over glass and debris, her body still frozen with adrenaline. They didn't return to sleep. Aluki secured the door with furniture, paced the cabin for hours, and kept the flare gun close at hand. When the sun finally began to rise, she wrapped both children in layers of fur and led them to the snowmobile parked near the kennels. The dogs were still tense, ears flat and tails tucked, watching the tree line. Aluki rode to the closest ranger outpost, over 30 kilometers away, balancing Noah in a sling and keeping Kimia between her arms. The ranger team responded within hours. Tracking dogs found the bear's path easily, wide prints dotted with blood and scorched fur. The trail led to a frozen stream several kilometers north, where the bear was found resting beneath a snow-laden overhang. It was old, underweight, and covered in half-healed scars. Rangers determined it had likely been struggling to find food for weeks. With the sea ice vanishing earlier that year than ever before, many bears had remained inland, scavenging in desperation. They said this one had lost its fear of humans and crossed the line of no return. It was euthanized the same day. The family never returned to the outpost. Within a week, Aluki had relocated her children to Iqaluit, enrolling Kimia in a local public school and applying for a job at the general hospital. The cabin was boarded up, though the dogs remained, taken in by a neighbor. Kimia, once unshakably brave, began to struggle with sleep. Any barking startled her. Her mother bought her earplugs and a small light for her bedside table, but the fear lingered. For months, the attack was discussed quietly by those who lived near the Arctic shore. Some blamed climate change, others blamed the decision to raise children so deep in bear country. But everyone agreed on one thing. That night, it was not just hunger that drove the bear, but desperation as well. The scars on the window frame and floorboards remained long after the snow melted and the cabin fell silent. In time, they became part of the land's quiet memory. One more reminder that even in sleep, in warmth, in places built to be safe, the wild could still find a way in. On the night of September 14, 2022, the wind swept cold and steady across the ridges of the southern Carpathians, rattling pine branches and stirring the damp, mossy earth. At nearly 1,400 meters above sea level, the Romanian Army's Mountain Division had established a temporary bivouac on a forested slope above Valea Rea, hidden beneath layers of camouflage netting and tarp-covered tents. The exercise was a high-stakes simulation, a week-long training in low-visibility navigation, stealth movement, and radio-silent communication. Private Vlad Chernat, just 19 years old and 6 months into his conscription, had collapsed into his sleeping bag after a grueling 15-hour march through rugged terrain. His tent, a low 2-person shelter held by ropes and pegs, rested near the edge of the main camp, half concealed beneath a fir tree. Exhaustion blurred the edge of his awareness, and when he heard what sounded like heavy breathing and soft footfalls just after midnight, he thought it was simply a fellow soldier stumbling through the dark. He blinked awake, trying to focus. The sound grew louder, low, irregular huffing, followed by the creak of twigs snapping under heavy weight. Then came a sudden tension in the tent ropes. A shadow pressed against the thin nylon wall, and in the next instant, the entire shelter collapsed inward with a dull rip. Vlad barely had time to shout before he was enveloped in darkness, nylon fabric wrapping around his face and arms as something massive crashed against the canvas. Disoriented and half-blind, he struggled to crawl free, his knees catching in the folds of the tent. A blunt force struck his shoulder, followed by a searing pain as claws raked across his upper back. He felt hot breath on his neck, a weight pressing into the collapsed tent frame, and instinctively curled into a ball, shielding his head. Outside, sentries heard the commotion and rushed toward the edge of the encampment. Flashlights snapped on, slicing through the dark, but it was the sudden roar of a flare gun that cut through the mountain silence. The red arc lit up the clearing, revealing the full shape of the threat. A large brown bear, nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, its eyes glowing and fur matted with mud. Startled by the sudden brightness, the bear reared up, turned sharply, and smashed through another tent nearby. Soldiers scattered as the animal barreled through the bivouac, knocking over supplies, tearing ropes from trees, and sending radios and gear tumbling into the underbrush. One tent pole snapped cleanly as it struck the animal's side, but the bear paid no attention, its panic now matched by the chaos of the men trying to react without live ammunition. Someone activated a loudspeaker, blasting static and distorted warnings across the campsite. The sharp feedback, coupled with the flicker of additional flares, finally drove the bear away. It turned, crashing downhill through the trees, branches snapping in its wake as it vanished into the dark forest. When the dust settled, 2 tents had been completely flattened, several personal packs torn open, and one field radio smashed beneath a paw print. Soldiers quickly formed a perimeter and began searching the area for casualties. Vlad was found crawling from beneath the shredded fabric, blood running from 3 parallel claw wounds across his left shoulder and back. His right eye was swollen and his uniform shredded, but he was conscious and coherent. Medics responded within minutes, treating the wounds with field dressings and evacuating him by jeep to the nearest command post for helicopter transfer. The gashes were deep, but had missed his spine and vital organs. Though the bear's attack had been brief and chaotic, the fact that it had come so close to lethality during a controlled military exercise raised serious concern among commanders. The following morning, investigators examined the site and found scattered ration packs near the edges of the camp. Though soldiers had been instructed to bury or hang all food items at least 100 meters from the sleeping area. Several plastic pouches containing protein bars and meat-based stews were discovered under a low tarp near Vlad's tent. It became clear that someone had either failed to follow or misinterpreted the storage protocols. The scent of those rations, especially pungent in the cold air, had likely drawn the bear in from the deeper woods. Wildlife officers from the Ministry of Environment were notified and arrived later that week to assess the incident. They found fresh scat and hair samples, confirming the animal had been an adult male, likely ranging far from its normal territory. The unusually dry summer, coupled with a failed berry season, had pushed more bears into lower elevations, where they began to explore human camps for food. Though the Army did not issue a public report, internal memos quietly updated wilderness protocols across all mountain training zones. Field rations were now required to be sealed in bear-proof containers, and all bivouac sites would be subject to stricter perimeter checks. Soldiers were retrained in bear encounter protocols, with new emphasis on non-lethal deterrence, noise systems, and scent control. Private Vlad spent 10 days in recovery at a military hospital in Brasov. His wounds healed with minimal scarring, though the psychological impact lingered. He later requested reassignment to logistics, preferring the predictability of transport and supply over nights spent in the unpredictable wilderness. The rest of his unit completed the exercise, though morale remained shaken for days. Even hardened veterans admitted they'd never experienced anything quite like it. In the Carpathians, stories of bear encounters were common, but rarely did they involve such close, violent contact during a disciplined military operation. The attack became a cautionary tale passed between units, reminding soldiers that no matter how well trained they were, the forest always played by its own rules. That night, under a camouflage net torn by claws, the boundary between man and wilderness had briefly vanished. And it was a 19-year-old private, tangled in nylon and shadows, who had come face to face with it. On October 19th, 2024, under a dull, overcast sky, 42-year-old Zachary Wolf moved methodically through the underbrush of Kodiak Island's interior, miles from the nearest road and far beyond cell range. An Anchorage native and lifelong hunter, Zach had spent most of the past 2 decades in Alaska's wildest corners. He was careful, experienced, and well-versed in the dangers of bear country. That morning, he'd taken down a large buck near the edge of a muskeg flat, a clean heart shot from his .308 Winchester. Confident and unhurried, he began field dressing the deer near a patch of dense alders, kneeling beside the carcass as he worked through the familiar steps. The blood pooled thick and dark around the clearing, soaking into the moss and fallen leaves. Steam rose faintly from the exposed organs in the cold, damp air. Zach was focused, his hands moving with practiced rhythm, the forest around him silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. His rifle lay propped against a spruce a few feet away, close, but not close enough. Then he heard it. A heavy snap, too loud for a squirrel, too purposeful for the wind. He froze, his gut clenching instantly. He turned his head slowly toward the brush behind him, heart rate rising. Another crack followed, closer now, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of something massive moving through dense cover. Before his hand could reach his rifle, the foliage exploded. A massive Kodiak bear burst through the alders, fur dark with rain, eyes locked onto the bloodied clearing. It was over 1,200 pounds, old, scarred, and hungry. The scent of the fresh kill had brought it in fast, and Zach's presence didn't slow it down for a second. It didn't bluff, didn't hesitate. It charged straight through the clearing and struck him from behind with a crushing blow. Zach's body slammed into the ground, his face smashing into the cold moss, his breath torn from his lungs. He tried to roll, but the bear was already on top of him. Its jaws clamped down on his right shoulder with terrifying force, shattering his collarbone in a single bite. Its claws raked across his back and ribs, tearing deep through layers of fabric, flesh, and muscle. He couldn't scream. The pain was blinding. Training and instinct took over. He forced his arms over the back of his neck, curled his legs, and tried to stay still. He knew movement could make it worse. The bear didn't stop. It grunted, breathed hard, bit again, and battered him with its paws. The weight of the animal pressed down like a boulder, crushing the air from his lungs and grinding him into the earth. For nearly a full minute, the bear mauled him, biting, clawing, rolling him through mud and deer entrails. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. Zach felt the weight shift, then vanish. He lay still, unsure if it was gone or merely watching. Every inch of his body screamed with pain. Blood soaked his jacket, his back was torn open in several places, and the warmth of his breath on the moss was the only thing he could focus on. Then he heard the dragging. The bear was hauling the deer carcass away, its prize won. It moved off without a backward glance, crashing through the underbrush and vanishing into the trees. Zach didn't move for several more minutes. He wasn't sure he could. His right arm was useless. His ribs felt broken, and every breath came with a sharp edge. But he knew if he passed out, he might not wake again. He reached into the pocket of his torn vest and pulled out the GPS beacon he always carried. His fingers, slick with blood, struggled to press the button. Finally, the red light blinked. Signal sent. He was bleeding badly, dizzy and dangerously cold. Using his good arm, he dragged himself toward the base of a spruce tree and leaned his body against the trunk. His vision blurred. He could feel his consciousness slipping, but he forced himself to stay awake. 6 hours in the wilderness with wounds like his felt like an eternity. The wind picked up, and a drizzle began to fall, soaking through what remained of his shredded outer layer. At 6:47 p.m., a Coast Guard helicopter hovered over the area, zeroing in on the GPS signal. The rescue team rappelled into the clearing and found Zach barely conscious, pale, and soaked with blood. His jacket had frozen stiff in places. Paramedics stabilized him, treated the bleeding, and airlifted him to a medical center in Kodiak. Doctors found he had a shattered collarbone, 4 broken ribs, puncture wounds across his shoulder and back, and multiple deep lacerations, but no damage to major arteries or spinal nerves. He was lucky, they said. Remarkably lucky. The deer carcass was never recovered, but rangers later confirmed that bear tracks, consistent with those of a large male, had been found leading toward a nearby ravine. The area had seen a spike in bear activity that fall, with food sources dwindling early and multiple reports of aggressive scavenging behavior. Zach's attack reignited long-standing debates in Alaska's hunting community about solo hunting practices. Though solo trips were common and often preferred by seasoned hunters, many now questioned the risks. Some argued that bear spray should be mandatory in high-density bear zones, while others insisted on stronger safety training for isolated hunting. Zach himself, once fiercely independent, admitted from his hospital bed that things could have ended much worse. He said he would never again set out alone without a flare, a sidearm strapped to his chest, and his rifle within arm's reach during every stage of dressing a kill. He spent nearly 4 weeks in recovery, undergoing surgeries and physical therapy. The scars down his back would never fully fade. Neither would the memory of the weight of that animal pressing him into the ground, nor the sound of it breathing over him as it ripped through his gear and skin. But he survived. And for those who hunt Kodiak's wilderness, that's sometimes the most you can hope for. On the night of July 17th, 2023, a soft breeze passed through the dense hardwood canopy of a national forest in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina. Tree frogs chirped under the stars, and the last embers of a campfire glowed faintly near a clearing where a small group of teenage campers had settled in for the night. Among them was 16-year-old Darius Miller, a first-time camper from Asheville, who had chosen to sleep in a nylon hammock strung between 2 tall poplars near the edge of the site. Darius was adventurous and curious, but not particularly experienced in the backcountry. He had joined the camp to challenge himself, to get away from screens, and to prove, mostly to himself, that he could handle the wild. That evening, he had helped cook chili on a camp stove, shared stories under the stars, and fallen asleep beneath the shifting leaves, lulled by the rhythmic creak of the hammock and the sounds of the forest. Not far from where he slept, an unattended backpack had been left near a boulder, half-zipped, with 2 granola bars tucked inside a side pocket. No one had thought much of it. The counselors had warned about food storage, but fatigue and inexperience had made someone forget. Just after 3 a.m., shadows moved among the trees. A black bear, likely a subadult male, lanky but large, crept into the clearing. Drawn by the faint scent of the food, it moved on silent paws, nose twitching. It sniffed at the fire pit, nudged a folding chair, then padded over to the pack. A low grunt escaped as it yanked it open, tearing at fabric until it found the bars. It crunched them quickly, then turned its head toward the nearest movement, the swaying of Darius's hammock. The bear walked closer, ears forward, curious but not afraid. Darius stirred in his sleep, shifting to one side, and the nylon creaked. The motion triggered something in the bear. With one quick swipe, it struck the side of the hammock, claws ripping through the fabric. The impact was jarring. Darius was thrown out and landed hard on his side, the breath knocked from his lungs. For a moment, he didn't understand what had happened. Then he saw it. Dark fur, low eyes, the wide shape of a bear no more than 2 feet away. Instinct took over. He tried to scramble backward, kicking at the ground, but pain exploded through his leg as the bear lunged forward and bit into his calf. Its jaws clamped down hard, shaking briefly before releasing. Blood soaked into the dirt as Darius screamed. The sound pierced the night and echoed through the trees. Another camper nearby, awakened by the commotion, cried out in panic. The bear froze, then turned and bolted into the woods, crashing through the underbrush and vanishing into the darkness. Counselors rushed to the scene with flashlights and first aid kits, faces pale and movements rushed. Darius was lying on the forest floor, groaning and clutching his leg. Blood pulsed from several puncture wounds, and his ankle was twisted unnaturally to one side. They stabilized him quickly, wrapping the wounds and splinting the leg as best they could, then radioed for help. It took over an hour for an ambulance to reach the access road. Paramedics carried Darius out by stretcher along a narrow trail, every jolt sending sharp pain up through his leg. He was barely conscious by the time they reached the vehicle. At the hospital in Brevard, doctors confirmed he had a fractured fibula, several deep puncture wounds, and torn muscle tissue. The bite had narrowly missed major arteries. He was lucky by a few centimeters. Back at camp, rangers arrived by dawn to assess the site. They found claw marks on a nearby maple, paw prints in the soft dirt, and bits of the shredded backpack near the fire pit. They concluded that the scent of food had likely drawn the bear, which returned to an area it may have visited before and reacted aggressively when startled. Camp officials suspended all overnight trips for the remainder of the summer and issued a formal statement promising a full review of their safety procedures. Bear-proof containers were ordered immediately, and every staff member was retrained in food management and wildlife deterrence. In the weeks that followed, Darius's recovery was slow but steady. He spent 6 weeks in a cast, attended physical therapy twice a week, and took painkillers to manage the nerve flare-ups from the deep tissue damage. He didn't talk much about the night at first. When he did, it was in fragments. About the sound of the animal breathing, the speed of the attack, the pain that came all at once. For a while, he avoided the woods altogether. The thought of sleeping outside made his chest tighten. But by the following summer, he surprised everyone, including himself, by signing up for a different hiking program. This time, he insisted on helping lead the food safety briefings, demonstrating how to hang bags, how to seal bear-proof canisters, and what to avoid doing near camp. He said it gave him back a sense of control. The attack became a cautionary tale. Rangers began distributing flyers about recent bear encounters and hosted talks for youth camps about scent discipline and noise deterrence. Most black bears were shy. They reminded people, but were unpredictable if startled or emboldened by food. The clawed maple tree near Darius's campsite remained standing, bark peeled back in 3 long diagonal scars. Some counselors began calling it a marker, a reminder that even a single forgotten snack could change a night forever. For Darius, the pain faded slowly, but the lessons stayed. The forest hadn't stopped being beautiful or worth exploring, but it had become, forever, something to respect. On the morning of August 12, 2021, the first light of dawn spilled softly across the gravel channels of a braided river deep in the wilderness of northern British Columbia. A group of wildlife photographers, 5 in total, had set up camp along the banks, where glacial runoff met spruce-covered slopes. The trip was led by 29-year-old Caleb Riker, a seasoned wilderness guide with over a decade of experience in the backcountry. Caleb was careful, known for his calm under pressure and deep knowledge of the terrain. He had led dozens of groups into remote valleys where roads faded into memory, and the only sounds came from wind, water, and wildlife. That week, they had trekked 2 days through thick brush and unstable slopes to reach the riverbed, prime territory for photographing caribou, moose, and, with luck, grizzly bears from a safe distance. The night before the attack, heavy rain had soaked the camp. The tarp over their cooking station had sagged under the weight of water, and their food, hung rope to a tall spruce, had slipped lower than it should have. Caleb had spotted bear tracks just before sunset, pressed deep into the muddy riverbank near camp. He noted the direction and width in his weatherproof journal, but said nothing to alarm the group. At first light, he rose before the others. The fog still clung to the trees when he stepped out of his tent, boots crunching over damp gravel. He carried no rifle, just bear spray strapped to his chest and his GPS device clipped to his belt. His goal was simple: check the food hang and resecure anything that might have been lowered during the storm. No one saw what happened next. Sometime around 5:20 a.m., faint growls echoed across the riverbed, low and close to the ground. One camper, still in his tent, thought it was a moose. Another heard splashing, as if someone were wading through water too quickly. But the sounds faded, and no alarm was raised. When the sun fully rose and Caleb hadn't returned, concern spread quickly. His tent flap remained open, untouched. His journal lay inside, a pencil tucked neatly between its pages. His boots were missing, as was his pack. The group searched for nearly 30 minutes before finding drag marks in the gravel and a wide disturbance in the willows near the bank. They contacted authorities with their emergency beacon just after 7 a.m. A helicopter team arrived 4 hours later, dropped 2 rangers at the site, and began aerial sweeps of the surrounding terrain. It didn't take long to find the body. Caleb's remains were discovered 400 meters downstream, half submerged along a narrow offshoot of the river. His pack was shredded, his torso covered in claw and bite wounds, and his bear spray was still secured in its holster. Mud and blood streaked his jacket. Nearby, deep paw prints were etched into the riverbank, circling the area. Investigators pieced together the attack from the scene. A grizzly bear, large, powerful, and unafraid, had likely been drawn in by the scent of fish scraps discarded near the food prep zone the night before. Although Caleb had been diligent, someone in the group had rinsed cookware in the stream without checking the runoff distance. The scent had spread quickly. The bear had waited. The tracks suggested it approached from the forested slope, remained just beyond view, and only moved when Caleb stood beneath the food hang, distracted and alone. The suddenness of the ambush, the drag marks, and the lack of defensive spray indicated the attack was swift and brutal. Over the next 48 hours, rangers remained in the area, patrolling for signs of the bear. On the second night, it returned. A camera trap set near the original campsite captured its image: broad shoulders, scarred muzzle, and matted fur soaked from the river. It showed no fear of the empty camp, sniffing at gear and moving deliberately around the fire pit. The rangers tracked it through the undergrowth and made the difficult decision to euthanize the animal. It had learned to associate camps with food and had now killed a human without provocation, a risk that could not be ignored. Caleb's GPS device, found clipped to his belt, had stopped transmitting just before 5:30 a.m. His journal remained legible, the last entry scribbled with urgency. Tracks by East Willow, fresh. Claw spread big, solo male maybe. Rechecking food lines before first light. The entry, made only hours before his death, served as a solemn reminder of his awareness and his commitment to protecting those in his care. The news of Caleb's death sent shockwaves through guiding circles across Canada and the U.S. He had been considered a rising figure in wilderness safety and conservation education. Dozens of outfitters he had worked with reviewed their protocols overnight. Some began requiring bear fencing around all campsites. Others banned the rinsing of cookware near waterways entirely. For the photographers who had accompanied him, the trip never truly came to an end. Each recalled the quiet that followed the discovery, the way the forest seemed to press in tighter, and the weight of guilt for a misstep they hadn't even noticed at the time. A memorial was held in his hometown of Smithers a week later. Friends and colleagues spoke of his knowledge, his gentleness, his love for the raw spaces of the world. His parents requested that donations go toward wilderness safety programs for youth, a cause Caleb had planned to support that fall. By autumn, signs had been posted at popular trailheads along British Columbia's interior river valleys. Keep food sealed. Do not rinse dishes in water sources. Never approach fresh tracks. And never walk alone at dawn. The river continued to flow over the gravel and bones. The scar in the willows healed slowly. But the memory of what happened there, quiet, sudden, and unforgiving, remained in the land, and in every step taken cautiously through the trees that lined its edge.